Hey folks, if you've been watching our videos for a little while, you know that I don't exactly hide my challenges with Sony cameras, but the day has come. The day has finally come. And Sony is doing some pretty incredible things. And what makes this day come, you ask? Well, it's this thing, the Sony A7 III. I am blown away, simply put. For the price, for what you pay for and what you get in this camera, it is by far the most exciting release I think Sony has made in a long time. For $2,600, that's $600 less than the A7S Mark II, and it's just as good, if not better, at low light. It also has a longer life battery. It is $3,000 less than the A9 and shares most of the same features. This might be a case of Saturn devours for Sony. I don't know why in many cases you'd buy those more expensive cameras, but of course I'd like to believe you get what you pay for. So I wanted to explore what exactly you get with this camera and what you're paying for, and is it worth it for you to step up to some of the other cameras that Sony makes. But by far, this is a very exciting release. Now, I did want to say that there are a lot of other people that got this camera before us, namely our friend Jason Lanier in the US. And Jason did a really great review, which I'll post a link to in the description below, and I encourage you to check that out. But what I want to talk about is some of the things that Jason and many of the other reviews don't talk about. And those are actually some of the things that have me most excited about this camera. First up, I want to talk about the design of the camera. I've been mostly critical of Sony when it comes to design, and that is because I find the buttons on the back of the camera to be really cluttery and really awkward in weird places compared to a lot of the other mirrorless cameras. And then their menu system tends to be a bit awkward as well, and things in weird places you wouldn't expect them to be. But things really started to change for Sony when it came to the A7R III. Now, if you're not familiar with the A7R III, this camera is visually identical. The only way you can tell the difference is by the logo on the front. So let me walk you through some of the big changes that happened with that camera and, of course, with this one. Number one is the overall body. It has this really great grip now, and you can't discount this. When you're hand holding this, especially for photography, it just really hangs nicely from your fingertips. So you can walk around casually with it, and it's comfortable. You don't worry about dropping it or slipping with it. So in terms of a daily use camera, photography, or video, I really love this hand grip. Number two is they've moved the start and stop button for recording video from the corner, if you're an A7S user, to the front. That is probably my favorite thing to happen, actually, because I can't think of a worse place to put the start and stop button on a camera than on a corner. That was really weird and hard to get to, especially if it was on a gimbal. So yeah, that is pretty exciting. That's pretty awesome. The next thing is the S&Q feature. Before, if you wanted to go to high frame rates, what you had to do is go into the menu system and then change it there. Now what you can do is just one click and you're into slow and quick. And slow and quick also gives you a variety of frame rates, from more than 24 frames a second and less, and it conforms to whatever your project timeline is, 24 or 30. The next design feature that I'm really excited about is the audio ports. Now, if you're an A7S user, you're used to the audio in and the headphone out being stacked on top of each other. Now they've moved them to two separate locations, and that makes a huge difference because every time, especially in the dark, I'm going to try to plug in my microphone or my headphones, I'm like, which one is it again? Is it the top one or the bottom one? Well, this one you know because they're on different panels. The front one is the microphone, the back one is the headphones. Makes a ton of sense, doesn't it? It's about time. And finally, the last thing that I really love about this camera is you now have two card slots, which is great, and one can do proxy recording, just like the A7R II. But I love that it's a flick switch to open up the latch now. It's not a pressure like on the A7S II where you have to push and pop this thing and it was always really hard to get open. Just a simple click gets that bad boy open, which is awesome. And if there's one last thing also, there's a joystick now, which is really cool. I don't use it so much. I mean, it's great if you're moving your spot focus around, something like that. But because the wheel does kind of the same thing as a joystick, it seems a bit redundant. So I feel like they're putting it on there because everyone's got a joystick now, but don't really need it. So back to the clutter. Okay, so next let's talk about what a lot of people are talking about with this camera, which is the low light performance. It is not like groundbreaking in low light. It's groundbreaking in low light when you consider the cost of the camera and what you're getting. This camera does something stupid like 100,000 ISO, which, I mean, let's be honest, you're probably not going to use that unless you're trying to figure out who's stealing the carrots from your garden in the middle of the night. So for the rest of us who have to produce good looking content, we have to figure out where that threshold is. Now, the big case against the A7S II was that the photo sites were really large, and that's how it got the sensitivity. S, in fact, stands for sensitivity. But the downside to that is that it only produced a 12 megapixel still image. Not really a professional photo stat. So if you're a photographer that also did video, the A7S II is kind of ruled out. But this sensor is 24 megapixels, which means that even if the low light performance is equal to the A7S, you have double the resolution for still images. All right, so let's look at the footage and find out sort of where the fall off tends to happen. When we look at 800 ISO, looks great. Bumping up to 1600 ISO, also looks very good. And then 3200 ISO, I'm very happy. And I would finally say that I'm also happy with 6400 ISO. I still find the image pretty good, though I feel like it's at the edge of my comfort level in terms of a nice, clean signal. There is a change there. It's not as clean as 800, of course, but most people who don't make videos or photos for a living probably won't notice that. It's only we that notice that because we're looking for it. Going up to 12,800 ISO, the image does start to fall apart a little bit, but if you're doing documentary projects or event shooting, I think it's totally acceptable, and a lot of people and a lot of clients may not even notice. It's only at 25,600 ISO where I kind of check out completely. But guys, clean at 6400 ISO, 24 megapixel sensor. 6400, 24 megapixel sensor. So I also did a little bit of a Kubrickian experiment. I wanted to see what I could light with just one candle on. I first placed the candle 1 foot away from my film camera on my desk and cycled through some of the ISO settings without compensating for exposure. I then took the candle and moved it 3 feet away just to see if I could light the whole area with that single candle. So truthfully, I didn't have a lot of time with this camera, less than 48 hours, so I couldn't do any real orchestrated tests with the camera. Mostly I could just bring it along with me wherever I was going and try to just shoot with it as much as possible in that time. So I brought it to the climbing gym with me and took a couple shots. It's a pretty low light gym, and I wanted to maintain a 1/250th to 1/320th shutter speed, and that meant that I had to shoot at ISOs between 4,000 and 6,400. But the images that it produces are really clean. And one of the things I really like about this camera is the mechanical shutter on it. It means that when you're shooting under fluorescent lighting, you're gonna get a lot less banding issues. So that's great right off the top. And speaking of the shutter, 10 frames per second, low light, it got every shot in focus. So the focus system that they've carried over from the A9 is totally top notch. So those are all the things that I really love about the camera. Now let me tell you about the things that still kind of frustrate me about Sony cameras and this camera in particular. First off is the high frame rate. Now it does 120 frames per second at 1080 HD, but because the high megapixel count, it's going to skip some pixels in order to give you the full frame field of view. And that means moire. It still has moire. Now, not as bad as the A7R2, which was unusable. Like 120 frames per second was unusable in my opinion. This is not unusable, it's just not great. So you really have to choose which situations you're gonna use 120 frames in and make sure that there aren't any sort of cross diagonal or vertical lines that are gonna conflict with the pixel skipping. Number two is while they have this great fold out screen, I don't understand why Sony still doesn't do a vertical fold out, because so many times I wanna shoot like this and I can't see it. The next thing that I don't like, but this is sort of a general beef about all mirrorless cameras except for the GH5, which is I hate, with a capital H, micro HDMI. There's no worse connector than a micro HDMI connector. I really hope one day that Sony adopts a full HDMI. That's not just for this camera, it's for all of their cameras. I think that would be a huge deal. The next thing that really bothers me about these cameras is the 30-minute maximum video record time. We use these cameras as B cams next to the FS5 and the FS7, and it's always a challenge because those cameras will run indefinitely and you have to stop an interview every, say, 25 minutes to let them know you have to make a new clip, which is really annoying. I understand that probably the reason they do this is that they want you to buy an FS5 or buy an FS7 There's no reason why that has to be limited on here as far as I know, because the GH5 has no record time limit. So you can do it, Sony. I know you can do it. Another thing when it comes to video is I wish that Sony would start incorporating some waveform monitors, especially because these cameras do shoot S-Log2, S-Log3, and waveform monitors are super helpful when you're shooting log. And I don't understand why they haven't incorporated waveform monitors yet. But again, let's go back to this idea that they probably want you to buy their video cameras if you're going to be doing a lot of that type of work. And then finally, the last is sort of a hybrid I know like, which is that the screen is now a touch screen. So you have touch focus, which you can move the focus around, much like most other mirrorless cameras have now. The downside is that it only affects the focus, and the touch doesn't allow you to do anything else. It doesn't allow you to select anything that comes up on the screen, and it certainly doesn't have any gestures. So there's no swiping or anything like that like Fuji cameras have. I would like to see them incorporate swiping. I think that there's a lot of features that you could take off the dial set and move to swipe and make for much faster movements and much faster changes to the camera settings. But for $2,600, this camera has an incredible feature set, a really amazing build, and I think that for people who couldn't afford the A9 or the A7R III, that you now have basically those cameras in your hand for $2,600, and that's amazing. So it makes all the things I'm critical about a bit of a moot point. I'm really excited to keep trying this camera and to see what Sony continues to do, if this is any indication of where they're going in terms of giving you more for less. And it's gonna put pressure on a lot of the other manufacturers to do the similar thing. Well, that's about it. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you got something from this. And as always, please subscribe to our channel and comment in the comment section below. We'd love to hear what you think about this camera. Until next time, happy shooting. How about a little bit of a lanyard flip?